In 2011, there was a massive earthquake off the coast of Japan, and that caused a massive tsunami. Now, that's bad enough having two disasters. However, that massive tsunami was bigger than what the Japanese thought was probable. And so Fukushima nuclear power plant was sitting right on the coast. It had a large barrier to prevent tsunamis reaching it. However, the tsunami was bigger than that barrier. And so what we had was a situation where the entire power plant was flooded. Now you think on the surface that mightn't be too bad, except their backup generators, so the giant tsunami, the giant earthquake had knocked out the electric power in the area, they had backup generators. However, this is a lesson, don't keep your backup generators in the basement if you live in an area that may be flooded. And so one of the reactors unfortunately overheated and caused a massive nuclear disaster. And still to this day some areas are still radioactive. However, it has settled down there. But these three disasters pretty much show that people still get a little bit concerned about how nuclear power works. And so when you look at that there, and so this is some data that was done in Europe. And so Europe has a reasonably large nuclear power generation system. And so a lot of countries, particularly some of those former Soviet bloc countries, do have power. France has power. There's a whole range of countries there. And one of the things there that the nuclear disasters generally mean that people are quite unfavourable about it. So if you look here in a country like Bulgaria, 52% of people before Fukushima were in favour of it, and afterwards it's gone down to 39%. Now, of course, what often happens in time is that people sort of get forgetful about these things, so that's probably gone up again. Now, another contentious issue is the development of the smallpox vaccine, or in fact, just the development of vaccines in general. And so when you look at the history of vaccines, so in terms of smallpox, you go back to Edward Jenner. And so in 1798, he produced work on the use of vaccines. And of course, most people are reasonably aware of the fact that he did what today would be an unethical experiment by getting a small 8-year-old boy on his farm, James Phipps, and he tested the smallpox vaccine by first injecting him with cowpox. He got a bit sick, recovered, and then trying to infect him with smallpox. And then after that, you've got things like Louis Pasteur develops other vaccines for other conditions. And then you go back to the early 20th century, where you have things like the Spanish flu, causes a worldwide pandemic. You also have, new influenza viruses. You have polio vaccines being produced. You have a whole range of those things there. And of course, smallpox being the start of that in the Western world, eventually was eradicated in 1980. And so what we've got there, smallpox is the only disease that's ever been eradicated by vaccinations. And, a huge amount of that there. Particularly one of the problems with that is that microbes, because they do reproduce rather quickly, develop new strains. And so things when the COVID pandemic hit in early 2020, started off with one strain, and then very quickly there were multiple strains. And often those multiple strains are immune to previous vaccines, which is sort of the way, the little battle that goes on between vaccines and microbes. Now, of course, one of the problems with the COVID vaccine is there was a lot of misinformation about it being dangerous. And people sort of think, vaccine hesitancy is new, but no, it's been around for a long time. And it's one of the problems with human nature is that people's own biases actually cause them to doubt things. And so, there was things here that were worrying that the vaccine was going to cause harm to people. an ad from the early 20th century, so the Anti-Vaccine Society of America, who are sort of saying it was almost a religious thing here, saying that, their body is pure, and if they put something else in there, they're going to be impure. And so, it's been around a long time. However, one of the main problems with vaccine hesitancy is exemplified by this graph here from the World Health Organization. So what we have is that since 2016, the number of measles cases, or in this case, the number of global deaths from measles has started increasing. If you look at from 2010 to 2015, even though there was little bumps, the trend was downward. And 2016 is probably when the global anti-vax movement really got into top gear. And measles is a completely preventable disease, and really sad that 200,000 kids in 2019 lost their lives simply because people wouldn't get vaccinated. And there are some people, for medical reasons, immunodeficient people, who can't get certain vaccines. And if the general population isn't vaxxed, they're in trouble. Another big scientific engineering feat that has changed the world is the development of flight. And it's really interesting to think that, flight, the early tests of flight were done in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century. And between those tests being done at the start of the 20th century, within 30 years, or 35, 40 years, there was jet engines. So, and then within another 20 years after, you also had rockets being built as well. And of course, most people are quite positive about flight. You've got some advantages there. It's really easy to get from one part of the world to the other. Living in Australia, you can get to the United States in about, I think Hawaii, maybe about 15 hours, it's possibly even less than that. You can get to England, you can get to Europe in about 20 hours. These are trips that used to take 3 months if you're going by boat. And so that's a really good advantage there, because people can get from one place to another without losing a huge amount of time. Air travel is also quite comfortable if you discard the legroom. People can actually sit there for an extended period of time and not be too uncomfortable. However, there are advantages. There's the idea of it's quite expensive compared to other forms of transportation. Although that has changed, flights are now relatively cheap. It's become a competitive industry. But probably the biggest thing is the idea of airplane crashes. Now, of course, aircraft crashes, a lot of people unfortunately may die, and they dominate the news cycle for a while. However, when you look at it, and this is a question from a past HSC paper here, if you look at it overall, air safety has improved. There's not a huge number of crashes. There is infinitely more people die each year driving cars than they do in air crashes. It's probably the safest form of transportation. Another thing that elicits positive and negative aspects is this idea of mining dams. And one of the things there, there's pros and cons of everything. And often people, when they think about dams, they talk about, it's going to destroy an area, which in some cases it can. However, in a large city like Sydney, you need a very large dam to provide clean water to a city of several million people. And also some areas use the dams as well as hydropower. So down in the mountain area, in the snowy mountains, there is some hydropower being generated. And in terms of electricity generation, it doesn't produce carbon emissions, so it's a fairly green resource. However, dams are incredibly expensive to build. They do destroy wildlife in an area. When Warragamba Dam was constructed, there was a whole heap of old indigenous sites that were under the water. Animals, plants had to move. There's even some small villages that had to move. If you also look at in China at the Yellow River, they built the world's largest dam, and that had to involve the moving of millions upon millions of people because this dam was needed. And that's the thing. Most of these arguments here, you go back to flight, you go back to vaccination, you go back to nuclear power. There's arguments for and against, and it's really important to think about here. And this works with all of these things here. So, when a dam's working well, when nuclear power, they work reasonably well. They give you everything there. However, a failure can be catastrophic. In the dam sense there, if the dam bursts, then there will be a giant flood, giant river, which will destroy everything in front of it. The nuclear power fails, then you're going to have a huge amount of radiation spread around. Vaccinations, there are very rare cases where people do suffer life-changing or life-ending reactions. Flight, you can have a massive air crash that kills people. Now, they are all tragic events, but the number of people who are affected by them is infinitely smaller than the number of people who benefit, and that's a really important point.